Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana, outside of Tel Aviv. It is the week of May 28th, 2025. And today's episode is called simply 600. This Thursday will mark 600 days since October 7th of 2023. And in today's episode, what I want to do is just reflect a bit on what that means, that 600 days later, we are where we are. And my hope is that I can share a few insights that maybe you haven't considered before as we're reflecting back on just what it means that 600 days after October 7th, we still have troops in Gaza, we still have hostages being held in Gaza. One thing I can reassure you is, or one thing I can say for certain, I should say, is that nobody really knew what would happen when the war began in those early days after October 7th. But I can pretty much guarantee you that no one thought that 600 days later we would still have hostages there and that we would still be fighting the war, or that the prime minister at the time, Netanyahu, would still be the prime minister today. What I want to do now, though, is leave some of those more obvious insights and approaches to where we are 600 days later, and instead explore some aspects of these past 19 and a half months and ask some questions that we might not necessarily be asking and look at some aspects of Israeli society that we might not have considered until now. So, in no particular order, here are some of my thoughts on the fact that we are now 600 days out from October 7th. So, first and foremost, I would say that these past 600 days have revealed the absolute best and the absolute worst of what Israel is. On the best side, what easily comes to mind is the volunteerism, the soldiers showing up for reserve duty again and again and again. We are looking at soldiers who've done over 300, maybe close to 400 days of military reserve duty at this point. They go back for one tour after another. They do more than is asked of them in any other country of the world, and they do it with pride. And it's the families taking care of the families who have someone in the military reserves. It's everyone rallying behind this idea that our country is incomplete until all the hostages come home. So you're seeing really the best of what it means to be Israeli, the volunteerism, the communal spirit, the looking out for each other. But at the same time, these past 600 days have revealed undeniably the absolute worst of the country as well. You know, I always heard that Israeli government was a bit corrupt and wasn't completely democratic, but I sort of assumed that all governments are a little bit corrupt and no democracy is a full democracy. But I never knew until these past few months just how filthily corrupt the government in Israel is. And as people who love Israel, it might be very hard for you to hear that. But I don't want to belittle the point. The government here is absolutely and disgustingly corrupt. And I'm talking about back deals, deals made in the back room, behind people's backs, illegally, as we're seeing right now with the appointment of the new head of the Shin Bet, which was done literally in an illegal way. I'm talking about a prime minister who over 80% of the public now believes is carrying on the war for personal goals, not for goals that suit the country. And we all know what those personal goals are. His coalition will fall apart if he does not conquer Gaza and keep the war going. because he has these right-wing members of his government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others, who will leave the majority and allow the government to crumble if he does not continue the war and take over Gaza. And so that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a new chief of staff who will pretty much do whatever Netanyahu wants. A new head of the Shin Bet, the Shabak, who is a friend of the family. And so you are seeing just how corrupt this government is. And it's really appalling to me and so many Israelis who are living here. By far the majority believe right now that policy is being dictated by personal goals of Netanyahu and his coalition, not the good of the country. And so it's hard to deny that anymore. You used to be able to say, yeah, but all in all, it's still a democracy. Now the veil is off, and we're seeing just how corrupt this government is. And it's baked into the system. It has to do with the coalition government and needing a majority of 60 plus one in order to rule here. But the deals that are made, now we're seeing how the sausage is made, and it is really appalling to so many of us here. Number two, this has revealed these past 600 days the extent of the Haredi problem. You know, in the early days of the country, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, were maybe 3% of the country. And so it wasn't so impactful if they didn't serve in the army, if they weren't a major part of the workforce. But now they are over 13% of the country. And for a while, we've been able to sweep it under the rug and kick the can down the road. They haven't been serving in the army like the rest of us. They don't work like the rest of us or pay taxes like the rest of us. But we were always able to sort of ignore it, sort of willingly, because we didn't want to deal with it. We can no longer ignore it. The past 600 days have shown us that the Haredi problem is a problem, and it is not going away. The fact that in 2023, 60,000 eligible ultra-Orthodox men were given exemptions from serving in the army, at the same time that you have others who are doing, like I said, their 300th and 400th days of military reserve service. There's no way forward for the country unless we solve the Haredi problem. And I don't know how it's going to end. This government seems content to not draft them and to not deal with it because, once again, their coalition will fall apart unless they can keep them on board. So I don't see a solution in sight, but it really is a problem that can no longer be denied. Another insight, another thought I have over these past 600 days is that the protest movement against the government has been a complete failure. And I think it's time that we just go ahead and admit that. These rallies that we've been having every Saturday night where people protest the government, these rallies in Hostage Square where they call for the release of the hostages and ending the war, they've been a complete and utter failure, except in one regard, which I'll get to in a second. But the government has not been paying attention to them at all. They've done nothing to move the needle in terms of what the government will actually consider for its policy. And I have reasons I think I know some of the reasons why this protest movement has been a failure. For one thing, it became politicized. Bringing the hostages home should not be a political issue. Everyone should want the hostages to come home. But somehow, from the very early days, it became a political issue that those on the left who are progressive want us to bring the hostages home, and those who are on the right support the government and want the war to continue. And somehow it became political. I think if you look at the name of the movement, Bring Them Home Now, you know, there was a proposal very early on that slogan should be changed to Release Them Now. or let them go now, putting the onus on Hamas to release the hostages, which is really where it should be. But instead, it's become bring them home now. And the implication of that is that the current government wants them to be in Gaza, and it's up to them completely to bring them home or not. And there's just been a lot of mixing between the bring the hostages home movement and other political uh, arenas in this country. I believe it was at last year's Pride Parade, the LGBTQ parade, which is a very important issue. I believe in full LGBTQ rights, but I believe what happened is they had members of the Bring Them Home Now movement leading the parade, standing at the front. And so once you start equating LGBTQ with freeing the hostages, it becomes a progressive left-wing issue that doesn't appeal to everyone in the country. And so I think we have to recognize that we ourselves have failed in terms of how we went about building a protest movement, building a movement against the government, because it really hasn't been effective. Now, I did say that there's one area in which it has been successful, and that has been in letting the hostages in Gaza know that we are still thinking of them and we are fighting for them. Many of the hostages who've since been freed have come back and said that they saw the protest movement and they saw the rallies in Hostage Square on their behalf, and it gave them hope and made them know that the country was thinking of them. So that's the one upside, if you will, the one success of these rallies. But in terms of actually changing government policy or making an impact on what our leaders do, uh, we need to admit it's been an absolute failure. It was not planned the right way, and it hasn't worked at all. Sort of related to that, another reflection from the past 600 days is that there is no left in Israel. There really isn't. We have the leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, and he's pretty much impotent. No one really respects him. He's lost a lot of the respect he maybe did have by always opposing the government. And just because you're the opposition leader, that doesn't mean you need to oppose the government every single time. When we were fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, Lapid was calling for a ceasefire with Hezbollah. And had we had that ceasefire, we would not have taken out Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. And I'm not sure that beeper operation would have gone down. So Lapid just seems to be this knee-jerk reaction politician who protests the government no matter what. No one here really takes him all that seriously. And then we have Yair Golan, who is head of the New Democrats. And just this week, he said that the hobby of IDF soldiers is to kill babies in Gaza. And this is pretty much a gift to every anti-Israel person in the entire world, never mind the Arab world, who can now use this against us, that one of our own is saying that we're baby killers. I mean, what was he thinking? Who did he think he was going to appeal to by saying this? And yet, this is where the left is right now in Israel. And that's why there really is no left. There is no such thing as a left-wing politician who can speak on behalf of those who have more progressive values. In fact, poll after poll has shown that if elections were held today, Netanyahu would still win for prime minister. The only person who could defeat Netanyahu head to head is my neighbor right here in Ra'anana, Naftali Bennett. But aside from him, everybody else loses, whether it's Lapid or Yair Golan or Benny Gantz. So there is no real opposition here in Israel. We need to recognize that as well. Another thought is that Israeli PR is worse than nothing. You know, it's often been said that Israel really doesn't have any PR. And I would argue that it's worse than having no PR. We're actually doing bad PR. We're making the situation worse. In a way, it would just be better if we shut up and didn't say anything. But instead, our PR has been counterproductive and has hurt our own cause. I'm referring to what Yair Golan said this week, of course, that the IDF soldiers that their hobby is killing babies in Gaza. And just in general, we have totally fumbled when it comes to presenting this war to the world. There was that 36, 48-hour period right after October 7th where they were having a moment of silence in the baseball playoffs and at NFL football games for Israel, the victims of the Hamas terror attack. And we did nothing to capitalize on that public opinion, which leads me to the next point, which is the messenger is the message. You can say whatever you want about Netanyahu's policies, but the fact of the matter is Netanyahu is such a jackass and so reviled by every other leader in the world. Nobody likes him as a human being. Like, no one respects him as a person. And the fact that he is such a bully and such a jerk, and just in the way he behaves on a personal level, has made it completely impossible for Israel to get any kind of message out there. Because no matter how good our message is, when it's being delivered by a blowhard like him, who is so unlikable, there's just no way for it to land on the ears of the public. And so one of our biggest mistakes has been allowing him to stay on these 600 days. How did we do that? How is it that so many others have stepped down, whether it's the chief of staff or the head of the Shabak or the head of intelligence or others, and yet the man who was prime minister on the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust is still in power? That shouldn't be happening, and that is on us. But it's because the messenger is the message, and there's no difference between the message and the messenger when it's being delivered by someone like him. Anti-Semitism. I think we all kind of knew that there was still anti-Semitism in the world and anti-Israel sentiment. But these last 600 days, I think, have made it clear that it is much more ubiquitous than we thought and much more endemic to the culture than we ever would have guessed. It's to the point now where it is now cool to be anti-Israel. The same way it's kind of cool and hip to be vegan or gluten-free or to not wear leather or to buy carbon credits when you fly and all these other progressive kind of cool actions. It is cool to be anti-Israel. It's hip to be pro-Palestine. I don't think we realize just how endemic that anti-Israel sentiment was, or just how powerful Arab residents of their countries are. And it's getting there in the US as well, but it's certainly already there in Europe. So this is going to be a big thing for Israel to contend with down the road. And I think for me, one of the biggest revelations of all is that the real threat to Israel, we're now realizing, is internal. I think ultimately Israel can handle Iran. Israel, for the time being, has handled Hezbollah. And one thing I'll say about this war in Gaza, it's very unpopular here in Israel. Most people want the war to end in favor of an agreement that brings the hostages home. But the fact of the matter is, we are, it seems to me, from what I've heard, crushing Hamas in Gaza. It seems that they are scrambling, that they're running out of money. They're running out of support within the Arab world because Israel is pretty much demolishing Gaza at will. So in that sense, say what you want about Netanyahu, but it does seem to be working if our goal is to finish off Hamas. But again, I and so many of us are starting to realize that the biggest threat to Israel is the internal threat. It's Jew on Jew. When you have 13% of the population who's eligible to serve in the military, but who time and again is given excuses not to. When you have the hilltop youth, these religious parties living in the West Bank, and they go and they torch Arab villages, as they have been doing, and beating Arabs, as they've been doing, and they are not arrested because this government won't arrest them, pretty much giving them free will to harass and beat and murder Arabs as they want. This is a segment of our own population that we need to deal with, but we are not. So if you ask me what my greatest fear for Israel's future is, it's certainly not Hezbollah or Hamas or even Iran. It's the internal fighting, the clash between the religious and the non-religious, the Haredim and those who do serve and work in mainstream society. I'm talking about civil war, and I don't know if it would look like civil war the way it did in the late 1800s in the US with actual weapons firing on each other. I don't see that kind of civil war playing out. But the kind of civil war where we have distinct populations that don't talk to each other and see each other as the enemy, that kind of civil war is already happening. And that's what the next government needs to solve, because I see that as the bigger threat to Israel's future than any of these external ones. So where do we go from here? Honestly, I have no idea what lies ahead. My personal prediction, I do not see the hostages coming home. I just can't envision how that would happen at this point. Hamas, as crushed as they may be, does not seem to be willing to simply give up the hostages unless Israel agreed to a complete withdrawal from Gaza. And I do not see Israel agreeing to that as long as this government is in power. So I don't see the hostages coming home anytime soon, certainly not this summer. I would not be surprised at all if we got to Rosh Hashanah and the hostages still aren't back, and perhaps even to 2026 and beyond. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm trying to picture a scenario where I'm not wrong, and I just can't see it. I just don't see that happening. And for the time being, yeah, it does seem like this war is going to go on as well until we demolish more and more of Gaza. So I don't see the troops coming out in the near future either. The big question is, can Israeli society survive? We are a very resilient people. I think on a personal level, we still do get along really well. I run into Haredim here and there because my wife is from Bnei Brak, and that's a very Haredi neighborhood. And our personal interactions with them are never unpleasant, and they're good people. But it's what happens when you build up a picture of the other in your mind. Can this country survive so many of us building up these kind of pictures of who the other are? Because we're all convinced that if it weren't for the other, the country would be in much better shape. Believe me, the Haredim believe that the country is being, in trouble because of us. Uh, so it goes in every direction. But to me, that's the real question: is what will Israel be like? How will we survive the internal struggle that we have? A lot of you sent in questions this week, and I'll try to get to a few of them. And they're very relevant to current events, as it turns out. Sue writes in, I remember years ago you spoke about your first book at CSAIR, that's the Conservative Congregation in Riverdale. The book is called 188th Crybaby Brigade. Thank you for remembering, Sue. And she said you mentioned that the Israeli army was careful to avoid hitting civilians. Has the current army changed? Is it because of the change in the government or the increased number of right-wingers in the army? The perception of my friends, even those who are supportive of Israel, is that the army has changed. What do you think? Well, officially, this is a great question, Sue. Officially, the policy of the IDF is to not harm civilians. That's in our Tohar HaNeshek, our code, a purity of arms, our code of battlefield ethics. that we do whatever we can to not harm civilians. Now, of course, that's very challenging because we are fighting it's not even a military, we're fighting a terrorist group who uses civilians as human shields. So it's made it virtually impossible for us to not harm civilians. And in fact, I would go even further and say that our enemy, they want civilians to be killed because for them, that's what gets world opinion on their side. At the same time, I would have to agree with you, Sue. It does seem like in the past few weeks, something has changed. It just seems like we are seeing more and more killing of civilians. I wouldn't say indiscriminately, but maybe it's just because we're running more missions. Let me tell you this. Throughout the day here in Israel, we hear fighter jets zooming overhead. I'll be on a walk or I'll be going to a meeting in a cafe and you just hear fighter jets. We are doing dozens and dozens of bombing missions over the course of a day. And the result of these missions is that Gazans are getting killed. Now, is it necessary to take out Hamas? Many of us would argue, yes, it is. And we'd also say that the onus really at the end of the day should be on Hamas. Give up the hostages, put down your arms, and there will be no more civilians killed. But I have to agree, it does seem like the army has loosened up a bit. And this actually does relate to a question from Judy. Judy sent me an article in the Associated Press about how Israeli soldiers in Gaza, were using Gazans as human shields in a systematic way. And this does seem to be confirmed by soldiers in the IDF who came out anonymously to admit that they were given orders to use human shields. And what this basically means in terms of the article, the way it was reported, is that Gazans would be given IDF uniforms. They would put them on and have a camera inserted onto their helmet, and that they would go in first into a building to see if the building was booby trapped or if there were Hamas terrorists in there. And then if they found that there were none, then IDF soldiers would go in. So the soldiers were protecting themselves by sending the Gazans in first. I mean, talking to you as a former soldier in the IDF myself, I can totally see why you would want to do this. You would not want to walk into a booby-trapped building. So why not use a Gazan civilian instead? But legally, in terms of the ethics of war in Israel's code of ethics, it is absolutely against the law to do this. And the IDF is investigating this practice, which some, even in Israel, have been saying is ubiquitous in Gaza and in the West Bank. But again, this goes back to one of the points I brought up earlier about Israeli PR just being so terrible. We cannot get out of our own way. If we simply did nothing, that would be better than having these stories come out where now we're using human shields in Gaza. So yeah, Judy, it does seem that it is true because a number of soldiers have come forward, even officers have come forward and admitted that this has been the policy. I wouldn't say it was necessarily widespread, but it certainly is against Israel's code of conduct in battle. And we'll have to see what actually happens once it is investigated. Rosemary wrote in to ask, is there any way that Netanyahu can save face and end the war? And the short answer to that question is no. At this point, he cannot save face and end the war. He has to keep on going because he's been saying so long that the war cannot end until Hamas is no longer in power and all the hostages are home. Uh, he would have to emerge with his tail between his legs to pull, were he to actually pull the soldiers out of Gaza. And I don't see Netanyahu doing that. Also, his coalition wouldn't survive. So no, Rosemary. That's why I think this war is going to keep going on. It's also why I think the hostages will sadly remain in Gaza for quite some time. Evan wrote in to ask, about the two Israelis who were murdered this past week in Washington, D.C. at the event outside the Jewish Museum. He asked, are Israelis reacting to this? And this is exactly the kind of question I want. I can't give you the necessarily the political aspect or the logistical aspect of the shooting, but what I can do is tell you what Israelis are saying. Israelis are shocked and horrified. These are two of our own. All the more so because, so many Israelis dream of going to America and escaping all the chaos of Israel. If only we could live there where we'd be safe and quiet. And we're realizing more and more just how unsafe it is to be Jewish and to be Israeli outside of Israel, which is so ironic that the safest place to be Jewish is still in Israel, despite all the missiles from the Houthis, despite having enemies in the West Bank and Gaza. I personally believe the safest place to be a Jew right now in the world is in Israel. That's not why I'm living here, but I happen to believe it's true. Canada has just issued a warning to Jews and Israelis to not show outward signs of being Jewish and Israeli. Apparently, there's some huge anti-Israel protests about to take place in Toronto and in Waterloo. And so they're telling Jews and Israelis to tuck in your Magen David, your Chai necklace, don't wear your kippah in a public way. I mean, what world are we living in that in Canada you can't walk around speaking Hebrew or being openly Jewish? This is the world we're living in. And so, as horrified as Israelis are, we're also just in disbelief that this is what the world has come to. And I think it's made people more hesitant. I know people who are thinking of traveling to the US who are now reconsidering it, or letting their kids travel there and are having second thoughts. So yeah, it is hitting Israelis quite hard, especially as we see just how much anti-Israel sentiment there is around the world. And Laura wrote in with a similar question. She said, I live in Boston, and how safe is it for Jews to be in the US right now? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think you speak to the point that many Jews are hesitant to be openly and outwardly Jewish in the world. And who would have thought that that were going to be true 600 days after a massacre in which 2,000 Jews were killed, never, not to mention all the horrific and gruesome acts that were performed upon Israelis by Hamas, that 600 days later, we could not walk around Canada, the US, other places without having to be afraid for being Jewish. That concludes this week's episode of Inside Israel. I genuinely thank all of you for tuning in, those of you who joined the live broadcast. Next week, there is not going to be a live broadcast because it is Erev Shavuot, and by the time the holiday comes in here, it would either be 6 in the morning for you to get this in, or it would be too late and already Chag here in Israel. So next week, there will not be a live broadcast. However, we will have an episode drop on the Wednesday after. That'll be, I think, June 5th. So you can still listen to Inside Israel. It'll be an interview that I had recorded with a guest that'll run that week. If you want to learn more about the podcast, you can do so at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And you can always watch and listen to the recording of this one 24 hours later. It is posted on my website. Once again, thank you for joining in, everyone. We only can imagine what the future of Israel will be like now that we passed the 600-day mark since October 7th. Like so many of you, I can't believe that we are 600 days out and we still are where we are. But we have to move forward, yachad, together. So thanks so much for joining us, and I will see you live in 2 weeks. Lehitraot. I'll leave the chat open for a couple minutes.